Well, the other day, somehow I ended up watching a video by uh, a YouTube channel that was in some way affiliated with Lyndon Larouche. Might have been called Larouche Pack or something like that. I don't remember the name. I'd never seen it before. I certainly did not subscribe to it, and I don't intend to ever watch it again. Lyndon Larouche is somebody I've come across a couple times, and it's always been a real mixed bag, but he's some flavor of neo-Marxist. I don't know if he's strictly a Marxist. I don't want to characterize him too specifically because I don't really know, but he believes in a vigorous government, and his followers, a lot of people who believe in that, find him very charismatic. Among the very progressive, among the very left-wing, there's not that many politicians that they get excited about. Maybe somebody like Kucinich, the dumber ones for someone like Obama, but Lyndon LaRouche is one of them that they sometimes do. And I don't know what his political role is. I think he went to prison. I don't know if he's actually ever held elected office. I think he has. I probably should have looked up Wikipedia before this, but it's kind of irrelevant because he personally wasn't in the show. It was just proponents of him, and it was a nice guy wearing a nice suit. It actually looked like one of the guys in The Office, actually. Strikingly so. But the genesis of the video was basically that we're in an economic troubles, and the reason we are is because the government isn't directing industry. And they used the example of Detroit, and they said Detroit was fine during World War II when the government was, telling them to build tanks and planes and guns and everything was wonderful. And that's how we won World War II, and that created prosperity in Detroit. And now we should just do that again. Now, they don't want to go to war again. They seriously, literally call for a colonization of the moon and Mars, and that all the government needs to do is say that they're going to do that and direct as much money as they did in World War II, paying people in Detroit to basically make that happen. And Detroit will become the land of milk and honey once again, and the country generally. Now, there are so many problems with that narrative that it boggles the mind. First of all, the enormous output of war material during World War II was not possible or caused by the government declaring it so. It was the prerequisite for that was all of the capital and accumulation, all the industrial output, all of the efficiency, all of the skilled labor, all of that stuff was there before. And it was a powerful edifice of industry, not because it was directed by government, but because it was directed by consumers. Henry Ford and General Motors and all the Chrysler and all the dozens, if not hundreds, of ancillary and lesser known industrial magnates that sprouted up in the Detroit area, and for that matter in the rest of the country, they were created to satisfy consumer demands. Now, consumers can want different things, but on net, they want the highest quality for the lowest price. And so the incentive for producers is to be able to produce the greatest quantity at the lowest cost, which entails a lot of things. It entails that they have to be efficient. They have to always be innovating. If you have a free market, you always have to be innovating to produce products that customers will choose over your competitors who will be doing the same thing. It minimizes waste because waste is a loss of money. Like I said, it increases efficiency, and it generates a tendency to mass produce things, but to do so in as efficient a way as possible. And consumers in the United States demanding things like cheap cars is what, and them volunteering to give money for that end is what created the industrial might of the arsenal of democracy, not the dictates of the government. It was the financial policies of the federal bank, of the central bank, the Fed, which were created to facilitate the activities of, actually not so much the U.S. government as the British government, that actually caused the Depression, not some inherent phantom within laissez-faire capitalism that just causes it to fail inexplicably, randomly, which is basically the way back, the classical economists had a fairly decent explanation as to why credit expansion. They couldn't explain why it happened where it did. The Austrians have been able to explain, yeah, it's credit expansion, and why does it happen in certain industries. But the government people, the Marxists especially, they don't have any idea. It's just some phantom, random goblin of capitalism that it will just happen every once in a while, which is not a very explanatory theory. Why did it happen then in 1929, 2008? Why not any number of other years? Detroit actually fared relatively well in the Depression because there was still a demand for their cars. Less so than perhaps in the past. They shifted to other models, but actually some of the best cars from that period were made during the Depression, because in order to compete, they had to say, okay, well, if people are going to buy a car, we have to make sure it's one of ours. And so some of the most sought after, high quality vehicles that were basically ever produced were from the 30s. And so we had a situation where, yeah, the government caused a problem, and the industry was rising to, becoming better because of that, in spite of the government. Now, during World War II, it is true that the government placed huge orders from Detroit, GM, from Ford, and enriched them enormously during the war. But the whole capacity for them to create such huge amounts of munitions were created on the market before the war without the government's interference. I don't know of anybody who could claim that during the 20s and the teens and the first 40% of the 19th century or the 20th century that it was government policy that made Detroit happen and made the industry there spring up. No. And the other thing the Larouche PAC people are blind to is that this massive government stimulus of the war industries in World War II is actually, we can date it, the actual birth of the military-industrial complex. Prior to this time, when in the United States, it's always basically been the government's policy to buy its munitions and weapons from companies. It's been unusual for the government to say, set up an armory that would simply build this. It has happened. It may still happen, but it's relatively rare. In Europe, it's much more common. But in the United States, the federal government would say, look, we don't want to set up the facilities, we'll just buy them. And prior to World War II, and actually just before World War II, but prior to 1940, the spring of 1940 to be specific, they had a process of bidding, where basically the government would say, either we want this specific weapon. So say the rifle they used in World War I is the Springfield rifle, bolt-action rifle. They would say, we want to buy Springfield rifles. This is how many we want to buy. Who can bid the lowest to provide this? And all different manufacturers would come and they'd say, we can build them for this many per unit or that many per unit. And of course they have to pass quality standards, but whoever built the lowest, they got the thing. And then there are even more general ones where they would say, we want a vehicle that can do the following things. It hasn't been invented yet, but if you can invent it, you will have our support, we'll buy it from you. And then different companies would go, and this even happened like the aeronautics industry, where like McDonnell Douglas and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and a couple other ones. There's one called the American Aircraft. There were several. Would all say, okay, the Army wants a new fighter, let's figure out a really good fighter, and they would have their teams go and try and decide. And at some point, the military would look at it and say, nah, this isn't interesting to us. But eventually they make prototypes, and they would take these and do trials, and eventually the government would select one. And then during the war, they would do outsourcing, basically, where other companies would build them. So in Detroit, they don't build any airplanes really in Detroit, but Henry Ford basically got a lease to build B-17s, which were invented in the mid-30s by Boeing, B-17 Boeing. And he built an enormous plant called, what was it called? Willow Run. That's right, Willow Run. An amazing factory. It took 2 or 3 years to build. And when it was done, it would produce a B-17 every 61 minutes. every 61 minutes, a B-17, at that point, still top of the line, most advanced, most expensive bomber. Not long after that, more expensive bombers would be able to. Just making sure I'm not getting visitors here. More expensive bombers, the B-29, would be invented later, but at that point, just think about it. This is a plane that is so expensive that the Germans in World War II never even attempted to build such a plane. Before World War II started, there was actually a lot of consensus that if you wanted a long-range bomber, something that could go as far as a plane could go and carry the most load, it had to have 4 engines. A 2-engine bomber couldn't carry nearly as much, and couldn't go nearly as far or fly as high. And Hitler actually went to Göring and said, well, we should develop a 4-engine bomber. It's not like the Germans would be incapable of building such a plane. But Göring said, well, we've looked at it, and if we build one 4-engine, instead of that, we could build 2 engines. And so if we build 4 engines, we will not have any bombers. We will not have enough bombers to do anything. And so they literally didn't have the resources to build. This is juxtaposed against the UK. They had 2 or 3 different 4-engine bombers, and the United States that was mass producing them. Germany can't even afford to build one. The United States has one factory that's producing one every 61 minutes. But the industrial know-how, the expertise, all the capital to make that happen predates the war, predates the government directing the industry, as the Larouchians would like to see. But then the Larouchians miss another point, because the war ends. What happened when the war ended is the military-industrial complex didn't end, it kept going. Oh, the other thing to note here is that the bidding process was eliminated in the spring of 1940. What happened was the government said, we're going to need a huge, before the war, this is before Pearl Harbor, this is about 18 months before Pearl Harbor, basically the government decided a war was going to happen. And they said, we're going to need all kinds of stuff, and we don't have it right now. We know it can be built, but so they went to the industry, and basically industry was reluctant. They said, look, we're not going to spend all this money to build new factories, to retool everything, to build a whole bunch of equipment that in 4 or 5 years we won't need anymore, that there won't be any demand for. And so, honestly, we're not going to do it. And what the government did to entice them was to say, okay, what we'll do is we'll pay for all of your, we won't do a bid, we won't say who will pay who will be able to produce this for the least. We'll say cost, we'll pay whatever your costs are plus a certain amount of profit. So if it costs you, if you have to build a $100 million factory, we'll pay the $100 million. If it costs you $1,000 to build, I don't know, a rifle, we'll pay you, that would be an expensive rifle, but it costs you $1,000 to build a Jeep, we'll pay you that plus 6%. That was about normally what they looked for, 5 or 6%. They almost always pay more than that because the industries would then basically weigh up their costs. I mean, they'd give their workers health care, they would build additional parts of the plant, and the government would pay all of it. And a better estimate is more like 25, 30% profit, depending on which company and which industry. Although there were never any explicit contracts that said you would get 30% profit, which produced a lot of arms for sure, but it also made it colossally expensive. And it also basically solidified these companies into they got used to this government trough. Now, after the war, and I don't know the specifics of this, military-industrial complex continued, but it shifted. The government no longer brought huge military supplies from Detroit. It got the industry for that shifted to California, to Texas, to Washington, so Lockheed, Boeing, firms in Texas, South Carolina. Ford and GM still have branches. There's GM Defense. I don't know if Ford has one called Ford Defense. But their piece of the government pie, of the subsidy pie, was vastly, vastly curtailed. But what didn't happen is they didn't get a tax break for that. The taxes on Michigan, which Michigan had been wealthy, Michigan had been very productive state for the first half of the 20th century, probably much of the 19th. And within the state of Michigan, taxes were very high. Michigan has high income taxes because they feel like, oh, look, there's a lot of wealth. We can just take a big chunk of it and use it to make the state better. The government stopped all these contracts, or greatly reduced them, kept the taxes, and then shifted the spending to the South and the West. So it was not quite ironically, contrary to the Marxist, leftist, progressive, Larouchian, Obamian, whatever other stupid idiot thinks this is, thinks that it was government that made Detroit great. It was government that, it was the market that made Detroit great. It was the government that made it retarded. I mean, that huge plant that Henry Ford built to build B-17s, I don't think it's built a B-17 since 1944 at the start of 1945. And when it was done with it, the only reason it was so efficient is because that's what it was made to build. The government didn't buy any more B-17s. They maintained a fleet of surplus for years, and of course, a lot of that surplus they just retired. And eventually sold to other countries or whatever, but they weren't buying anymore. And so that factory was not worth anything. Or in order to retool it for civilian uses would cost an enormous amount of money. But the government wasn't going to pay cost plus expenses or profit to retool a facility to make cars again, or Cessnas, or some other thing. It only pays it to make things that kill people. And then once it has them, it's not going to pay anymore. So I think Willow Lawn actually is now the actual airport, but the factory is a relic of history. An enormous, it's something with a very short term, very, very high time preference that produced no more good. As opposed to the car factories that Henry Ford and all of them built, many of those are still around. They're 100 years old, but they're still producing. Some of them even at a profit. Depends on which one and which company. But I don't want to get this into other specifics about the auto industry because there are reasons as to why it's stratified and whatever, and that's also because of the government. Government basically ended the free market in the auto industry a long time ago, mostly through regulatory capture. So that's how you end up with the big three. Is it's illegal for somebody else to become a fourth competitor. Even somebody like Bill Gates, who's a billionaire, he could say, you know what, I like computers, but I want to get in the car industry. He couldn't do it. Even if he paid all the lawyers and got all the permits and whatever, GM and Ford would just go to Congress and say, we'll go out of business, and the unions will lose workers, and it'll be bad, and they'll just say, you know what, you can't do it. And so you look at like the Fords and the GMs, they started with just a little bit of capital and like a garage, making a few cars. That's how they got their start. You can't start that way now. You can't start building cars in a garage. There are people who know how. There are people who can assemble cars from spare parts at a junkyard, and there are other people who can fabricate parts. I don't know about, and this is true most anywhere, it's true in Michigan. I know high school dropouts who can do it. I don't know how profitable their business would be, but they could at least try. There'd be thousands of them with the ability to try, hundreds who might do it, and tens or dozens who might succeed, at least enough to be in the market, and a couple who would do very well, who would become wealthy, who would establish great companies, at least for a time being. But that's never going to happen. When you cut off who can join, then of course you're going to end up with a 2 or 3 or 1 firm. They always say, oh, there's a tendency to a monopoly. Yeah, if you prevent other firms from coming into the market, eventually there will be a monopoly. Duh. And the fact, if you want to say that all this regulation is good and we need it, okay, fine. But then don't forget one of the consequences of that's going to be that you're going to end up, instead of having the big 3 and the medium 25 and the small 170, you're going to have the big 3 or the big 1 at this point, or big 2. We have GM and Chrysler are 1, Ford. The GM and Chrysler, as far as I'm concerned, are done. They're sucking on the government tin 100% now. Ford, they've been receiving government subsidy on the side and sometimes directly through some of their contracts, I'm sure. I bet if I really looked at them, I'd find a lot I don't agree with, but they didn't go fucking beg for money like the other two. So I'm going to give them a pass. If I buy a car, it will not be a GM or a Chrysler ever, unless they divest themselves of the government and become actually free market. But yeah, the government didn't create the prosperity in Detroit. The so-called stimulus of World War II actually gave birth to the military-industrial complex, which has hampered Detroit immensely. They've just siphoned off the taxes from Michigan. I guess Michigan is a net taxpayer, but they pay taxes, but they lose it. They don't get it back. So that there can be these plush offices, all these NASA facilities that the liberals love so much. That gets paid for by the taxes in Detroit. So Detroit's practically a wildlife preserve now, and I mean that literally. Like, so much of it has become vacant that it's overgrown, and there's deer and pheasants and foxes and cows and literally cornfields, packs of feral dogs. The population is half what it was in the 1950s. Talk about urban decay. And there are other problems with Detroit. It's not just the federal government. The city council there is communist. The state government is, you're run-of-the-mill. Hey, government spending is going to help you here. Let's stimulate this. So it's not like only the federal government did it. The city and the state had a hand too. But the idea that it was government direction that made it happen and all that needs is more government direction, no. It was the market that made it. It's the market that's kept it alive to the extent that it has. It's the government that retarded it, that made it waste all of its resources, so much of its resources on a temporary situation to build weapons of death for a war we didn't need to fight, by the way. We could just theoretically have said, well, we needed to fight it, so okay, short term. But then it kept taxing them like crazy. It just shifted the resources elsewhere, which the process by which that happens, by the way, I don't know the specifics about every single company, but after they got rid of the bidding thing, the bidding method, the way that happens is purely through lobbying and politics. Purely. Boeing goes to their senator, their congressman, and gives them a lot of money and support, and gets their unions to do the same. It says, you have to guarantee that we get these contracts. And Lockheed does the same. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, the congressmen in Michigan didn't do this, at least to the extent of their western and southern counterparts, and they got on the gravy train, not because of any merit, not because of the strategic interest of the United States, not because there's some intrinsic reason why they can build them and other people can't, because their congressman or their senator had the clout at the time to get it started. Once it gets started, it's very hard to stop, because then all of a sudden you're cutting off money, and then people are going to lose their jobs. And their jobs making overly expensive death machines that the government does not need. They may have a lot of expertise and talent, and they should be using that to help people. They should satisfy consumer demands, not the dictates of the state. It never builds plows. It always builds swords. Or in this case, neutron bombs. And, at super high costs. And it's not like those costs are free. The cost of that is having Detroit become a third world country, become Mogadishu, along with a whole bunch of other places as well. Detroit's one of the most dramatic examples. In the United States, it's probably the most dramatic example, but it's not the only one. So, government stimulus is the cause of our problems. It didn't create prosperity in the first place. It has always been a net drain on society, and specifically has caused the downfall of what was once a great city.